planning the schedule of events, one of the things that we wanted to do, at least in Kolkata, is to have a panel which featured all the participating traveling faculty poets from the University of Chicago. But because of the way that the schedule currently stands, it's either John Wilkinson at Jadavpur or it's Chico at Pressy, and we said, okay, we must at least have some kernel of discussion that is representative of the prodigious talent and the prodigious erudition that's housed in the University of Chicago. So without further ado, Lina Ferreira and Alison James. Thank you.
First of all, let me say that it's such a pleasure to be talking to you about your work today. So we're colleagues at the University of Chicago, but actually this is the first occasion we've really been able to get to know each other for various reasons, I suppose, with the pandemic and everything. I think I've seen you at online events and on Zoom, but we first met in person, I think, in India. So I'm so glad to have had this opportunity to get to know you and to read your work. And I'm glad too that in this festival, which you've given so much to, it's demanded so much of you, that we've been able to carve out a little bit of time to talk about your own writing and this really fascinating project. So today you'll be talking about a project that has as its origin one of the many outrages of the Trump era. And just looking back, it's a time that's so exhausting precisely because there was a relentless sort of onslaught of outrages, one after the other, insults, scandals. And you're starting from a case that was particularly shocking and I think dangerous, which is something you show in this collection.
I'm happy to explain.
Yeah,
it.
I'll turn things over to you, perhaps, so you can say a little bit about what you're responding to in this project, 100 Refutations.
Thank you for everyone who stayed. I know that we're not the main event, but I really appreciate the people who have stayed, whether you're part of Anitesh's team or not. So, 100 Refutations, let me give you some context. I think around 2016, 2017, the then President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, a president who's, I think, offensive to his core, to anyone who isn't himself, said, I think, one of the most offensive statements I've heard a dignitary say in a very, very long time. But perhaps one of the things that was most offensive to it is that at the time I was in my grandmother's apartment. My grandmother was my very first literature. I did not like sitting still, I did not like reading, but I could always sit down to listen to her telling stories, and most of the stories were ghost stories. And anytime that I wanted to tell anybody, like, oh, grandmother, Mamo, I would call her, I would say, like, tell this story. And she would say, no, it's not stories, it's histories. She would correct me, and she was my first literature. And to this day, I don't think I've ever heard a better story than the ones that she told. And they were the best stories because she believed them. And that's the difference between a story and a history, really. So I was sitting in her apartment, the woman who gave me literature, really, in the time that she had forgotten all the stories that she could have told, because thus is the nature of dementia. And we had just placed her in a home for someone else to take care of her because we could not care for her entirely. And I was sitting right beneath this virgin, the Holy Virgin Mary, whom she devoted her life to after the death of my grandfather. And from the kitchen, I hear the words that Donald J. Trump said. He said, shithole countries. That's just a shithole country. And he was referring to one of many countries specifically. But I hear it in Colombian radio. So as I'm hearing it in Colombian radio, I hear the voices of Colombians speaking and saying, well, it wasn't Colombia that he was talking about, but that country is very much like Colombia, so it's probably Colombia. But also then what else? It's Haiti for sure, but is it Cuba? And if it's Venezuela, then is it Bolivia? And they started creating this map of shithole countries according to one man's idea of what was a valuable country and what was not. And I'm sitting in my grandmother's apartment thinking of all the stories that she told, and the stories that are being forgotten, and the stories that she would never tell, listening to a man say that all these little things in her house, all the things that she loved, every single virgin, every single saint, every single picture of my dead grandfather was also shit, because it was a shithole country. And I was so angry, and I am still angry, and I will never stop being angry. Because what he's saying ultimately is that her life was worth nothing. And every single person in my country is worth nothing. And why is he saying that? It has nothing to do with who she was. He did not know her. But he had an idea that he knew her because she was born in a place that didn't have the freeways and the architecture and the computers that he decided were important, that made them valuable as human beings. That's what he decided. And that's what a lot of people agreed with. And how was I not supposed to be angry? But more importantly, how do you argue with someone who tells you you're not human or human enough? You can't come up to them and say, I am human enough. And if you don't have a space program, then they will not respect you, because that's what makes you worthy in the world stage. And if you argue with them, then you're telling them that their argument is worth arguing with. So I started thinking, in my rage, what can I say, what can I do? What is evidence of someone's humanity, of an entire people's value that can't be boiled down to architecture, to infrastructure, to GDP, which are just numbers, which are just ways to get from one town to another, which are nothing. That's not how you weigh human value. That's not how you quantify the existence of a human being. But I thought, there is one thing that is recognized and that is irrefutable, and that is poetry. Poetry does not need infrastructure, it does not need a space program, and it just happens. And it's like weeds, and it grows everywhere between the cracks on the sidewalk, even if you don't have sidewalks to walk on. So I thought, what better argument and refutation to a stupid, pointless, baseless argument? What better way to honor my grandmother than with a story that I believe, which is poetry. So that day I went online and I translated a poem from a shithole country, and I posted it there. And then the next day I translated another one, and then the next day another one, and then the next day another one. And then I contacted somebody and I said, hey, can you give us space in your poetry journal? And I will continue translating poetry basically until I burn out and I can't translate anymore, which at the time I estimated to be 100 days. I don't know if you've ever tried to translate a poem a day for 100 days while you have a job, but it is not easy. And it did not take me 100 days, it took me 6 months. So for 6 months, every day I translated a poem. I found the poem, I contacted an author, I translated it, I edited, and then I put it up, and then I talked to my editor, and then I redid it again. And I did it every day after work. I didn't sleep, I barely ate for 6 months straight. All I did was this project. And I put it online, and I made it free, because the point of it was not to make any money, not that poetry ever makes any money, but I realized halfway through that anger could only propel me so long, because I didn't want Donald J. Trump to read this poetry. I didn't want to prove him wrong, because he doesn't matter. He doesn't understand. What I did want to prove was to someone from one of these countries that he was wrong. Because I remember growing up in a shithole country thinking that I was a shithole person. And that was the argument I wanted to make. So I wanted it to be free, and I wanted it to be real, and I wanted it to be accessible. So 100 Refutations was born, and I got really lucky. I have an editor that is absolutely phenomenal. Her name is Kristen Elias Rowley from Mad Creek Books at the Ohio State Press. And it will become a book soon, which is what Alison read, a full manuscript. And if my editor kills me when I don't mention this, but I have also written another book called Don't Come Back. It's available for you to buy online. I don't get any real profit from it, but my editor does, and they're lovely, so support them and not me. So that's the story of 100 Refutations. And every time I tell the story, I'm really surprised because I start telling it and I'm like, this is a thing I did. And halfway through, I get really mad again.
I was going to ask.
Just over and over. It's been years and I'll never stop being mad.
But this is one of the questions you ask, though, in this collection. What do we do with our anger? How can we channel it, or what can you even say when you're faced with something like this? And I think you've already answered one of my questions, which is to do with the idea of refutation. How do you refute something that doesn't merit refutation? So would you like to read some of the poems from this collection?
Oh yes, I would love to read some of the poems. Just as I was saying, it really does surprise me. At some point, I felt like I gotten over my anger, but I realized now I was tired. I wasn't less angry. I was just too tired to express all of my anger. And it comes back. So I selected a few poems from this anthology, some of my favorites. And I was reading and I was trying to select, and I realized, oh, all of these are good. And then I realized they're good because I selected them. I like them because I chose them because I like them. So I am the intended audience for this anthology, but I hope that some of you will also enjoy it. It's still up online and you can access it whenever you want. I think some of the links don't work as well, but I'm working with my editor to make sure that the volume is very cheap if you did want to read some of these. So this one is called Of Wars and Oblivions by Aida Párraga, a Salvadorian poet. I think of that war, the one chasing us all, and all the ways to chase. It's time to forget, the delicate doves have told us. But what do doves know of the taste of blood and of the smell of midnight screams? What do they know if they wake up in their nests and mankind in a ditch? So I broke this anthology up into 100 days. So that was the very first poem that I started with. And I'm gonna be skipping around up until day 46, which marks around the halfway point of the anthology. And I hope you like it. So just for context, there's a lot of war in this, but again, I selected them, so they're more a reflection of my taste than anything else. This poem is called Little, Little Man by Alfonsina Storni from Argentina. Little, little man, little, little man, set free your canary, for she wants to fly. For I am her, little, little man. Let me leap. I've been in your cage, little, little man who gives me a cage. I say little because you have neither understood me nor will you ever understand. I don't understand you either. But in the meantime, open for me this cage. I want to escape. Little, little man. I loved you half a wing's worth. Don't ask me for more. This is my favorite poem to read. This is called The Existential Nothingness of Crabs, which is the most insane title I've ever heard. And it was the only one. I read all the poems very carefully, but I reached out to the author, to the poet. Her name is Lil Maria Herrera. I reached out to her before I read the poem because I thought no one who comes up with a title that good can write a bad poem. So I asked her immediately, can I have your poem, The Existential Nothingness of Crabs? And then I read the poem after she gave me the rights, and I was right. So that's very lucky, otherwise I would have gotten stuck with a bad poem anyway. The Existential Nothingness of Crabs. I make verses in the air. They crackle toward the infinite. Prophecy, crackling, crackling. I dance, building with my feet a trampling of clouds. I twirl like a ram. Now I am a she-Christ. Now navigator, now face up, now about to expire. My wings leveled in a dive. Yesterday I leapt from the bridge of the Americas. Today I stare at my naked feet upon the earth. I write plummeting parachute poems. I will not return to the place of butterflies. I'm only going to read, I made them specifically very short because I wanted them to be very accessible and for people to be able to read them very quickly in a busy time. We've had a lot of conversations during this conference about during this festival about how do we get people to read, and a lot of people have been talking about like, oh, the youth don't read anymore, and they need to learn how to read poetry and all of this, and my argument continues to be that it is a bad carpenter that blames his tools for his shoddy work, and it is a bad poet who blames his readers for not reading his poems. No offense to any of the poets that we have. We have phenomenal poets, but people read a lot, and people want to read, and people want to read about the things that matter to them, and it is our job to write about the things that matter in the ways that matter to them. So I think one of the ways that I try to make this matter and be easy is that it fits on your screen. So you can read every poem fitting on your screen very easily, and all of them are digitalized, so it would be easy to do. So this is, I chose this poem because since I've arrived in India, I've talked a lot about how I'm so far away from home right now, from Colombia, and from Chicago, from anywhere I've called home, except for the time I lived in China, I suppose. But I feel very much at home. If you ever get a chance to travel to Colombia, know that you will fit right in. Colombian traffic looks the same, pollution is the same, all the chaos is the same, and it feels very, very, very similar. It even smells similarly as well. So I chose this poem. This is by a Nicaraguan poet called Joaquin Pasos, and it's called The Old Indians, but it's referring to the natives of Nicaragua. And yet I think it feels very apt, and I hope you appreciate it as well. The Old Indians. The old men, very old, are sitting down beside their goats, beside their small, tame animals. The old men are sitting down beside a river that flows always very slowly. Before them, the air stops its march. It drifts by, contemplating them, touching them carefully, so as not to crush hearts made of ash. The old men take their sins out to pasture. This is their only job. They let them run wild during the day, and the day they spend forgetting. In the evening, they go out to set them free, to let them sleep beside them, to keep them warm. I really like the spontaneous clapping that happens here. That doesn't happen in conferences normally. No. So this is the penultimate poem. I wanted to read a poem by a Colombian compatriot of mine. It's called The Beautiful Text by Eliana Diaz Munoz. The Beautiful Text. Turned kamikaze. The poem was a bloody gob of spit, riddled with the tuberculosis of history that burst in the empty whiteness of my heart. And this is it. This is the last one. Only because I read it this morning and I felt that it was written for me specifically. This is a poem by a Bolivian poet. Bolivia has the highest capital in the world. It is very hard to breathe. And Elvira Espejo Aica is a native poet, an artist. She's an extraordinary woman, and she writes this two-line poems, just 2 lines every single time. And I think, again, to speak to people don't want to read poetry, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't want to read a 2-line poem. It's called The Sun and I. The sun at the highest peak, and I in a foreign country. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. So this is a collection that speaks from many places and from many times. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, you know, what you wanted to include, what kinds of voices you wanted to include, and how you made that selection.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like, in the festival, we've had so many metaphysical conversations. Everything is very big and abstract, and then you ask me these really concrete craft questions, and I love them. I love them in part because they give variety, but also when I was a very young writer, I think those were the conversations that I benefited most. Not just what do you write and how do you write about it, but concretely, how do you sit down and write a book? Like, how do you start an anthology? How do you finish it? The answer to it is an Excel spreadsheet, in case you're wondering. I have an editor. I have several editors, but I had Amanda Dombrink is one of my closest friends, and she edited this anthology as it was going throughout. I was sleeping really maybe 3-4 hours a night for those 6 months. And if Amanda hadn't gotten involved, I would have been sleeping 0 hours a night every single time, and I would have been dead, probably. But she helped me out. We created this giant Excel spreadsheet, and we wanted the anthology to be as representative to as many people as possible. I think a lot has been said about identitarianism, right? About having identity, like they only published you because you're queer, or because you're trans, or because you're, you know, from this particular part of the world or not that particular part of the world. And I think that's deeply unfair and also very narrow-minded, because what we're looking when we're looking for in representation is not how do we get as many people into one picture, but how do we speak in as many languages as people need to hear. So we're not looking for, you know, if we were doing an anthology for the United States, we're not looking for one Indian poet in there so that the white people can go, oh good, they have an Indian poet. We're looking for Indian voices so that Indian people and Indian Americans people as well can hear a language that they understand. My mother, a Colombian woman in her 60s, had never seen her culture represented well on television. And she saw this television show just like 5 years ago, and it's a very silly television show, but I found her crying in a room, a woman who never cries, because she saw herself seen, because she saw that someone had seen her. So when we sat down to make this anthology, the last thing in our minds was political correctness or identitarianism or representing, so that we would look like, oh yeah, we get it, we're cool, we're understanding, and we're gonna represent all these people. I wanted to make an anthology for people who don't get anthologies made about them. And as much as I really love Virginia Woolf and William Hazlitt and a lot of these British poets, they could only speak of the life they lived. And that is not the life I lived. And that is not the life you lived. So we made this Excel spreadsheet, this very methodical Excel spreadsheet, to try to speak to a very unmethodical, natural, organic, messy sort of life. So I know that the anthology goes split halfway, men and non-men. I know that I created a set of quotas per country. So there is no, even though, for example, Argentina has a higher percentage of representation of poets throughout the world. In Latin America, the worst country of all is Uruguay. You don't know this doesn't mean anything to you, but Uruguay produces more female poets than any country in South America. Uruguay is this big in comparison to anywhere else. So I love Uruguay, but I hated it because in the anthology they just kept trying to like build all the way up. You can take every Mexican poet in the world, but then do you have enough Bolivians? So it was really hard to find some, and then it was also really hard to find living poets that would respond to their emails. So I translated 120 poems. I only published 80 because 40 of those poets just never responded to my emails. And then I also split the anthology down the half between the mythic world, poets before the colony, before there was a European influence, and then poets after the European influence came about. And that was probably harder than the translations themselves. Translating things you love is not that hard ultimately, but trying to maintain a balance and trying to create something that would speak to as many people as possible was quite difficult, actually.
It creates a historical layering as well that's very interesting, including those voices from, 15th century, Maya poets and then very contemporary poets. It's a way of reflecting on kind of the violence of history and its legacy. I thought that was really
it's
interesting.
True.
Yeah.
Not every culture is as fortunate as Indian culture to have written history for as long as one does. a lot of, like, for example, where I come from, the indigenous native groups were oral tradition, which means that most of that poetry is gone, as just forever. And they favored creating art in materials that would decay very easily. So if it isn't in stone or if it isn't in gold, it goes away. And they were great weavers, and they created great woven histories. And yarn burns very easily, so that's what the Spaniards did.
Yeah.
That's what colonies do.
Yeah, so you end up with texts like the Popol Vuh, the Maya text, which is
Correct.
which survives then through
Exactly.
through translation or through
The ones that survive are on the stone. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. I was very struck by the last poem actually, which is I was just trying to skip to it in my copy.
I'll be honest, I do not remember what the last poem was.
The last poem is an unintelligible song,
Oh.
which is so I don't know if you want to read that one or if
I'd
don't
love
know,
to.
But
As soon as I look at it, I'm sure I'll remember it. Oh yes. So I think I purchased over this period of time. I purchased close to 60 anthologies of poetry with my own money. This was not a good project for my sleep, my health, or my budget overall. But I pored over all these anthologies, and I would occasionally stumble upon something absolutely like just sheer lunacy, and this was one of them. So I'll read the note that came from the literature of the Guaranis. The Guaranis is a lesser known people, the Mayas and the Aztecs. All of them are in Mesoamerica and in Central America specifically. But the Guaranis are down near the region of Argentina. And this was from the literature of the Guaranis by Joaquin Martinez, who wrote it in 1965, and it reads, "This is an example of a gau ete, unintelligible songs. Even for those who sing them, the chiripas say that this is authentic Guarani, inferior in purity only to the song of the spiritual leaders received from divinity itself." So the Guarani people will enter into this trance, and then they will make these noises, and they will receive the songs, poetry from the gods, and they will not know what they mean, because poetry from the gods is only spoken in the literature and the tongue of the gods, but they will still say them, and they will know that they are holy. And I love that notion. I love the idea of writing poetry, knowing that you don't understand it, but that in not understanding something, what you understand is that the world is so big that it can never be fully understood. And that is such a more powerful notion than any rhyme or any schema that I can possibly think of. Here is something that I don't understand, but it is beautiful. And because I don't understand it, but it must have meaning, must therefore mean that there is meaning beyond even our greatest imagination. And there's nothing more comforting to me than that. Because human imagination has come up with some really horrible, heinous things. But if there is more to imagine than we've yet imagined, then there's more to imagine than the terror we have experienced. I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly because it's not Spanish. It's been transliterated to Spanish, but I will do my best. Ajasi aru mbaha. Uru mbese guiri sambaha. Ahune kahune aru mbahasi ahasi. Ahune kahune haru ambasi. Ahune guahahuna guauru mbahasu. Gyahasi haru mbahasi. Guri guiratara guahu sinu. Wiki hagua guahasinu. Guaki guahisino guairi. Sanguasino wiki wasino.
thank you. I thought this was an extremely effective way to end a book which is also in part about this question of intelligibility and how we understand each other. It's also about language and the power of language, both to dehumanize and also to lay claim to humanity. So one of the questions that arises in the book as well is how we can weigh words. I think the weight of words is one term that comes up, and how can we weigh the words of poetry against some of the the rhetoric of hatred or dehumanization that that was the point of departure for the project, right? So so ending in with this poetry that just as you said, just sort of stands as a poem and is completely open in this way, I think is fascinating. Yes, so coming back to the question of how you compose this, and could you say a little bit more perhaps about the work of translation that you did? I mean, you said so some of the in some cases these are works that had already been translated, and you came up with your own version, and then in other cases you were the first translator. Could you say a little bit about that process?
Sure. So I started the poem. I started the project publishing on Facebook, and then I moved it into a publication. It was Brooklyn Rail, which is a fairly large journal online, and they have a dedicated translation page, and they just gave it to me for 100 days, which is really remarkable and generous of them. So initially, I got them all on Facebook, and then I got my editor, and then I got the space. So once we had the space, we were able to go like, okay, so these are the ones that we have already translated. So I had a little bit of a lead up, and we were able to put them together into little groups. So there was a week where I only translated poems on music, for example. And it was sort of like the music week, and we were able to like post links to music to go along with all of it. Okay. Because poetry and the lyrical should always be accompanied with something as powerful as music. And it was pretty easy as well. For example, Haiti's independence is really tightly connected to certain instruments like the datam. And it's an instrument I've never seen in my life before prior to it. So we grouped them together that way. That was pretty easy. In terms of so that was the organizational. In terms of what I translated, I translated about 120 poems, only 80 were published, and then I asked friends of mine to step in and translate from the French. I don't speak French, I don't translate French, but I have friends who do. So they translated the Haitian poems, and then I think I also got another friend of a friend to translate the Portuguese poems for me. And to your other question, your other part of the question,
it was about retranslation, I suppose. About poems that had already been translated and where you came.
I was very methodical with where they were coming from, who were we getting, what were the percentages, what were the quotas, big spreadsheet. I was entirely subjective when it came to what poems. I just chose what I wanted. So I read a ton of poems, I read a ton of anthologies, I went online and I found poets I'd never heard before, and if I liked it, I put it in. And because I was so angry, everything fell in line with what I was trying to say. But it was not methodical. I just loved it. I really love Cesar Vallejo's 9 Monsters. I love it. It's such a great poem. It's in the public domain, so I retranslated it and I included it because it's absolutely stunning. And I'm retranslating it now to see what else can be done with it. If a poem is good, you should be able to translate it endlessly, because translation, as you know, is interpretation. And the greatest literature allows for the greatest numbers of interpretations to it. So you should be able to translate something an infinite number of times if it is what literature is, what Adorno might give translatability to it, right?
And you need a translation.
Benjamin,
yeah, and you need a translation that speaks to the present as well. So I think that's part of the need for retranslation. You're retranslating it for this moment and for this project. Yeah.
Little Man was a poem that has been translated many times, but it's Small Man had been used before, or Tiny Man, and I wanted it to, like, I think it's really pejorative, right? Like, you tiny man, you don't get me, right? And I think that whole week we ran poetry of women sort of claiming their independence from a world of, male oppression, and I wanted it to sound really accessible, like something that you could say and lower the register a little bit to be that pejorative. So I think Little Man with a hyphen hasn't occurred before in translation of that poem, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and then in terms of the contemporary poets you include, who contributed pieces, you talk about the difficulty. You mentioned this just now, but also in the book you talk about the difficulty of getting people to respond, and then also the kind of fear that you sometimes encountered. I thought that was interesting. People who didn't want to contribute because they were.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So you say a little about that?
Absolutely. So this is probably well known as well. I got some, not the, they weren't death threats, but they were threats while I was doing the project. The project wasn't as widely known as I think would have warranted death threats, but enough people thought that what I was doing was not in line with white nationalism, which it very much isn't. I very much hope not. Yeah, no, I hope it burns to the ground. But it was still hostile. It was still a hostile environment, and I didn't have my green card yet, and I was very conscious of the potential danger I was putting myself in if I spoke ill of the U.S. government and made myself a target. This could certainly like make me ineligible if it seemed like I was, the words would be, if I was engaging in any type of terroristic language, unhappy situations. But I was angry enough that I was willing to roll the dials, but that wasn't the case for a lot of poets. And they wrote me and they said, and I think that the essay that you're alluding to is called Hello Sister.
Yes.
So this one poet wrote me, and she started her email with Hello Sister, and she meant hello sister in Spanish, hello sister in immigration, hello sister in vulnerability. And she expressed this deep love for the project and support, and then said, I can't participate. I don't have the paperwork, and I am afraid, and I don't have lawyers, and I am alone, and I simply cannot roll the dice that way. So I didn't take that poem, even though I really loved it. And then I was scared myself.
Yeah.
I have a green card now. I'm fine.
Still, it's scary time. Yeah.
Mostly.
I'd actually, we just talked about some of the these kind of prose essays that you with which you introduce each part, and then you have a kind of thematic organization of the whole. But I'd love to hear you read actually from some of these prose pieces. If you.
Oh, sure. We talked about reading Empire of Flies.
Empire of Flies, yes.
I'm happy to read from Empire of Flies. So I perhaps this wasn't clear. With every week, I would publish 7 poems a week, and then every time I would introduce them with an essay. So in addition to getting myself into the problem of translating a poem a day, I also wrote 15 essays to go alongside with them, which was exhausting.
Yep.
I'm still very tired from this project.
But they're great essays.
My first book is titled Don't Come Back, which was taken from that was the last thing my mother told me when she put me on an airplane and said, just don't come back to Colombia. I've been back since, but at the time my mother did not think that she or I were in a financial situation that would ever be possible again. But that wasn't the title I wanted originally for my book. The title I wanted was Empire of Flies. So I used that title in this essay, and unfortunately, Empire of Flies is already a book. I think it's a book about India, if I'm not wrong. But I still was able to use the title here, to at least use it, because I think it's an excellent title. Okay. When the Spaniards reached what is now called Bogota in Colombia, all they saw were flies. An electric black cloud of dark bodies humming, pulsing, twitching, and swarming. The quantity and color of them I once read in an old history book in the Luis Ángel Arango library in Bogota, while imagining a tribe of plucked paper wings and metallic bodies like fitted armor plates and wind-up tin toys. Those bodies is what led the Spaniards to the name that we now bestow upon the indigenous group of the region. And as I turned the page, I slid my finger on the glossy edge, and I cut a red meridian into my skin. In Castellano, moscas. In Spanish, in Español, moscas. In English, flies. The Spaniards wrote it in their journals. There were so many, in their letters home, in their best-selling chronicles, on the inside of their helmets, on the palms of their hands, and in the margins of their Bibles. There were so very, very, very many, because it was so unbelievable, too many to be men, that they could only compare them to flies. The Spaniards fell off their boats and wore out their feet hiking up the side of the Andes just to look deep into the eyes of the New World, and all they could see was a buzzing empire of black flies. Old world words for New World women and New World men. And this is what they are called today. I dug my fingernails into the paper cut slit and stared at the red print I'd left on the edge of the paper. I remembered my third grade social studies class teacher saying, muiscas, a slight variation on the old word, linguistic shifts and drift accents, pronunciations, misheard, misremembered, and misspelled, I was told. So muiscas, I wrote down on my notebook and stared at her as she dug her own fingers into a history textbook as if it were an open wound. That is what we are. Moscas, moscas, muiscas, flies. Though, of course, the only true thing about this story is that someone believed it to be true. So many, they said, and they had said, unconquered, unruly, undiscovered, ungodly, uncatalogued, and unnamed, blank spaces in maps and dictionaries, moscas, the book said they had said, and said enough times that we started saying it too, writing it down, reading it out loud, writing it, reading, repeating, shithole empires of winged insect, kings, and six-legged subjects. And some of them, I assume, were almost like good people. False entomology, fake etymology. Because they were neither unknown nor unnamed, and an old made-up story printed on a blood-stained page does not truth make. The people of the Andean Plateau knew that what they were. They had always known, and being known to foreigners did not change this. When the pale invaders asked, "What are you?" they replied, "Muiscas," in their native tongue, pointing at each other and themselves. "We," they said, in their native tongue, "are people, not flies."
Thank you. Well, should we see, are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah. You mentioned that Uruguay, despite being a relatively small country, produces the most number of women poets in Latin America. Why is that? Is it something to do with the literary traditions over there, or perhaps a reflection of a larger sociocultural movement?
That's a great question, and I did not expect it. One, they have the largest number in all the anthologies that I found. They had the most prolific number of women poets printed. So that was an offhand comment, which is to say that there are more poets than published poets exist. So I don't know where the greatest number of women poets exist. Very well could be Kolkata, as far as I'm concerned. But Uruguay has a tradition of publication. So publishing is easier and has been historically easier there. So they have a lot of publishing houses. They have a much smaller population. And they have a really high rate of literacy. And I think because of their influences, so Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, they used to be one country altogether. Brazil, Portuguese, former, Portuguese kingdom. So they have very different types of traditions. Different European countries have influences on different ones. So Uruguay is very close to Argentina. So they have a very close relationship to Italy, for example. So the literary tradition comes a little bit from there. But it's, so they were a little bit ahead of the curve when it came to misogyny. Misogyny in Colombia is getting a lot better, still there. So I think that lower misogyny, higher population of, higher rate of publication, and greater number of literacy in an earlier context led to more women poets being published. But I shouldn't have been an offhanded. There are lots of anthologies of women poets nowadays. But I love that that was your question. That's really great, fantastic. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Yes.
From what I understood, especially from the political concerns that were driving your project, the way you were thinking of it, I've often wondered that, you see, we've heard of, say, maybe Jose Marti or maybe Sandro Petroffi in history, just to mention two. I don't really remember any other examples who've been, their poetry and their politics or their revolutionary impulses, whatever, however they wish to formulate it, they sort of came together and it had a direct connection with the masses. There was a direct attempt to do that. In recent years, I'm sure there are a lot of poets who are driven by a lot of social, political, ideological concerns, but somehow, given the way the market has impacted the world, the poet has sort of receded from the public domain to an extent. So in today's world, how do you see the poet as not just a person who expresses all of these, very complex yet simple, range of emotions and thoughts, but also somebody who actually actively engages with this public domain? So number one, what I want to ask you is the poet as a public figure, as a public, the poet in the public sphere, number one. And number two is perhaps a bit more relevant to our country right now than perhaps in America. We've seen how, every time there's this, rightward, rightward tendency, artists, poets, a lot of other people who would otherwise perhaps would have not been so active in their, exposition, their articulation, they sort of jump into the action. Now, my question is, even in our country, we saw how, people gave back their medals, they started writing, some people even turned up at rallies. Wonderful, I'm all for that. But it also sort of concerns me that when times are a bit more liberal, when times are a bit easier, perhaps, in a democratic sense, even if not in an egalitarian sense, perhaps, in a democratic sense, I think poets have a role to play over there as well. And when things are easier, it is perhaps easier to talk about, the more fundamental points, perhaps the kinds of points that you were raising in your poems, because they're not just about specific political actions or whatever Trump said. It's about something else. It's about the social ideological basis of, a broader, identity and a lot of other things. So what I'm asking is, you see, I don't see most poets, speaking up when there is, space to do so. So how do you see all of that? I know it's, a difficult and, convoluted question. I hope you understand what I'm trying to hint at.
I also hope I understand what you're trying to say. That is a phenomenal question. I think that there's a lot to say and a lot to start with. First of all, I am not a poet, but I can answer a couple of things. Number one, I put this together. The risk that I was taking wasn't huge, but it was there. There was some risk. And I think, because I think we should be angry about things that deserve anger. Rage is not a negative emotion. Violence is a negative action. Very different, right? I think we should stay angry and we should stay guilty for not just what has been done by others or what we have done even, but what has been done, period, by the human race unto itself. Done. So I did it because I was mad, and I think that we need to practice when to be angry, how to be angry, instead of simply shutting down anger. Like that notion, that culture of this is positive emotion, this is negative emotion, and poetry should only be about love or whatever that else, that's nonsense. We need to do away with that. Two, we also need to respect that fear is real. And I would never have published poets that said, I am uncomfortable with that. There have been times in my life that I was helping to support my family, and I couldn't have taken that risk then. And maybe I shouldn't have taken this risk either, but it is a very fine line to walk. I will say, and I think Alison can back me up on this, in times of, because the thing that you're talking about is censorship in part, right? Because the powers that be do not want this published, and those who can speak to power do not want to be censored, whether that censorship is censorship of their work or of their entire existence, right? So we're talking about censorship in one way or another. I will say that in times of greatest censorship, there is also a great deal of ingenuity that comes up. And a lot of poetry, and not just poetry, but literature, even let's say Shakespeare, right? Very difficult to criticize the queen. But then you have most plays that take place in Italy with a queen that has this island. Okay, great. So it's not Italy, it's Queen Elizabeth. And the criticism comes in through that, right? So while I lived in another country where I did not agree with the politics there either, it was very easy for me to go like, you know how torture is terrible. That United States doing that torture. So I think that's a very low type of ingenuity, but poets and artists are very good at getting around the system. The state has blocks of power, and they're very good at controlling blocks of people, but they're not very good at controlling an individual. And an individual is always going to outsmart and survive. Think of cockroaches. Many cockroaches, maybe you can bomb them, but that's one cockroach that's gonna get through. And I like the idea of poetry and art as cockroaches and weeds. They just can't be killed. So on the one hand, I'm gonna say there's probably already poems that are being written in code that we need to learn how to read, rather than demand that they are written. 2, we need to be brave. That is very difficult to ask, because bravery comes with loss, and we cannot demand loss of others if we're not willing to take it ourselves. And 3, art is only a germ and an inception. It is nothing without action. Jose Marti said it, Shakespeare said it, and I'm sure you can back me up with other examples as well in terms of ingenuity. Am I wrong?
There are lots of examples. I'm also thinking about some of the poets and writers you include in the anthology who were often did face censorship or persecution, or even, I mean, I think you include a poet who was the last man officially sentenced to death in Colombia, but who was also in it.
Sure.
So I was just trying to think about this in relationship to this question as well. These are poets who are not separating their art from their politics. There are people who there are also writers who face attempts of silence and by other means. I think in this collection, I think that's also one of the threads that runs through the volume.
I will say one final thing, and I think the first part of your answer, correct me if I've misread this, but the first part of your question alluded to also poetry should do more, and how do we get more poetry out? And the thing that we forget about writing is that writing is a technology. And it started as a technology, and it's always going to be a technology. So nowadays, more people read than any other time. But it's also true that more people consume narrative than any other time in the world. Not only in film, but in video games as well. Mm-hmm. And some video games that I'm reading, I'm teaching a video games class next year in the University of Chicago, very narrative and video games class. Mm-hmm. And the number of video games that address political unrest is shocking. Mm-hmm. And because they're one-on-one and they're immersive and they're so well written, and they're addressing sort of big questions about what does it mean to be an individual in a community, and what is the difference between patriotism and nationalism, which is a question that is always relevant, and one that I face very frequently in Colombia. This is the Colombian flag, which I always wear on my wrist, and people have always gone like, is that nationalism and patriotism? I'm like, I am only representing me as a Colombian when I wear this flag. I am not dying for a country that has already killed so many. And that's the difference between nationalism and patriotism. So I really like the spontaneous clapping. I'm gonna miss it when we go back to the States. It's not gonna happen over there. So I think in terms of ingenuity, when we think about like how do we get poetry out there, how do we get the right messages out there, how do we write the right poetry and the right literature to be written, what we need to look at is not how do we invent something new, what has already been invented and was already being read, how do we get that out? And I think that's the key to the next time, the next generation, because we look back at like, ooh, those great poets and those great moments, and I always think of Dante. Dante is, the great Italian poet. The great Italian poet wrote in the language of the people. So he wrote in blogs. It would be the equivalent of a blog or a TikTok or a cheap song. But because it was really accessible, because it was technology that people really wanted to hear, he became the great poet, el poeta, as they would refer to him, right? So I think in order to cling to the identity worth rescuing, surviving, and protecting, we need to look ahead rather than back. I know everybody has been here for far too long. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Lina. This is
Thank you,
wonderful.
Alison. Thank you all.